Hey folks, Aces here, back with another interview for you guys. In this video, James Introcaso and I talked about rewards, loot, and treasure in Draw Steel. Overall, this interview was focused on asking, what is the purpose of loot in D&D style games? And James revealed him and his team's answer to that question so far in Draw Steel. It was awesome, especially near the end, for me at least, when I got to make some suggestions on level treasure design, and it felt more like we were in a design room pitching and exploring ideas rather than doing an interview. I'm personally excited to see if this discussion impacts the future development of the game at all. Watch it for yourself and weigh in the comments. This is the second interview James and I have recorded. You can find the first one linked in the description. Alright guys, let's dive in. Hey folks, we are joined again by a very special guest, James Introcaso. James Introcaso is the lead designer on MCDM's forthcoming flagship RPG, Draw Steel. If you want a long, more thorough introduction, you should definitely check out the last interview James and I recorded, which I released about a month ago. I will have it linked in the description and probably in one of those cards in the corner. But yes, James and I have talked before, so he's coming back now to finish, at least this is the way I think of it, is to finish the interview we did before, because the last talk we had was so fun. We actually went way over time and didn't cover all of the subjects that I wanted to talk about, including the most important one, for me at least, which is loot design in Draw Steel, or as you guys call them, treasures, although we'll get into maybe the distinction between those things. That's what we're going to be talking about today. James, welcome.
Yes, it is awesome to be here. Thank you for having me. And I did have a ton of fun talking to you last time, Aces. And thanks to your audience for listening to me yammer on again, this time about treasures and stuff with you. So I'm excited for this conversation because we were talking a little bit before this. You also mentioned this last time. You are a loot guy. And so so we're going to talk about loot. This is going to be great.
Yes. So a lot of my regular listeners will probably know this about me, but for all of the listeners that are clicking on this because of James Introcaso, which I'm sure is more than half, loot design in RPGs, both video game RPGs and tabletop RPGs, is kind of a passion of mine. And definitely in Draw Steel, like if right now people can test this, you can go to the MCDM Discord where they have a homebrew channel, and that's where a lot of the community posts homebrew stuff for Draw Steel even while it's in development. And if you filter by treasures, you will see my name on more than half of the entries of homebrew design treasures for Draw Steel.
Yes.
And so that shows you guys that I'm passionate about this subject, but also that I'm really, really excited for Draw Steel.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think that is 100% true. And it has been really fun. I poke in from time to time on the homebrew channel just to see what people are creating and that sort of thing. And it's been awesome to see your name pop up. And I think I've seen you're also on the Draw Steel subreddit as well, contributing. So thank you for that as well. Thanks for being part of the community.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Thanks for making a great game. I am going to assume a little bit that the listeners of this video have already checked out our first interview. Like I said, I see this as kind of a continuation, and that saves us a lot of time from going over a lot of the introductory stuff about Draw Steel that we already did. By the way, guys, you can also check out an interview I did with one of MCDM's senior designers on Draw Steel, Jordy. So I posted that one very recently. You can check that out. But just as the Spark Notes version, Draw Steel is a tactical, heroic, cinematic, fantasy, tabletop RPG. We go into detail on all of those things in the other interview. For people that don't know what all those words means, I would just say that Draw Steel is a game very much in the tradition of Dungeons & Dragons. However, MCDM, the designers, are taking a more first principles approach to this game and really examining and asking why for each of the conventions that exist in this now very long tradition of Dungeons & Dragons style RPGs. So is there anything else, James, that you'd like to add to introduce Draw Steel, or did I cover it all mostly?
No, I think that's perfect, right? And that's exactly it, right? We're creating something that I think in many ways will be similar to fantasy role-playing games like D&D and Pathfinder in terms of the stories a lot of people will maybe want to tell with it. But we've definitely tried to build everything from the ground up. You know, we have a lot of conversations like, what is the point of having loot in a game? Right. Is a conversation we had that I'm sure I'm going to be referencing throughout this talk, and then we rebuild stuff from the ground up and talk about, like, how does it affect our game, which is explicitly heroic fantasy and tactical, right? Yeah, so that's a big part of it.
You know, I said this last time, but the first principles approach that you guys are taking is one of the things that got me really excited about your game. I just think this approach to design has been very fruitful in other games, and it's also just, to me at least, I find it kind of academically and historically interesting, right? To really examine, you know, what is this genre of game about, and ask, you know, why we do things the way that we do. And so that's actually my first question for you is, what is loot for? And now before you answer that, I just want to talk about terms a bit. I use the term loot as a kind of catch-all for any type of progression for your character which is not tied to experience and leveling up. So definitely it would include things like a magical sword, but it might also include things like in your games, what you call titles, you know, where you become the lord of a realm or something like that. It might include, my understanding is you guys are planning to release retainers, you know, companions that you gather, stuff like that. I would group all of those into loot. But for Draw Steel, you guys use the term treasure mostly for like the physical items that you can pick up. Then you have titles, which are kind of like feats, but they're not tied to level progression. And then retainers are like companions that can help you with your, I think mostly out of combat tasks. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. So retainers actually, so retainers are a more specific brand of follower, right? We have this whole follower thing.
Okay.
And there are followers, artisans, and sages exist to help craft and research things for you. Retainers actually do follow you into combat and have combat use, but we haven't showed those off yet. Those are still in development. In fact, they will likely be in the next packet that we put out to folks.
Awesome.
So I have seen some retainer action. It's coming. Yeah. And you're right? Like all of these things fall under a category that we call internally, I think we call this externally too, rewards, right? These are the rewards you get for adventuring. And yeah, I think it's funny, you know, when we started that conversation internally about like, what is the point of loot? What is the point of rewards, right? What are these for? Why do they exist, right? It was hard for us to talk about it at first because back in the day, right, when in the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, gold was the goal, right? Like getting gold, getting treasure, getting loot was the goal, and the more loot that you got, the more experience you got, right? The number of gold pieces translated directly to the amount of XP you got as you would leave the dungeon, right? And so getting gold was like everything in those first editions. It was the only way to be rewarded as a player, right? Because you were like, well, we got to get in and we got to get that. You could avoid monsters and go get gold, right? And then over the years, D&D shifted towards like, it's really more about the monsters you defeat so that people face monsters, right? And become heroic to get experience. And then gold does this other stuff for you. It lets you buy equipment and stuff that is going to make you better at fighting monsters so that you can get more XP, right? A less direct reward there. So when we sat down, we had a long conversation about like, what is the point of rewards or loot in our game? And the thought was like, this is an explicitly heroic game, right? It's not a game about counting every last gold piece. And you often find, particularly in games like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, where there aren't a lot of ways to spend gold, there's a certain point where players kind of just stop tracking it, a lot of players, because they're like, now I'm just doing math, right? I'm just adding things up, and like, I know I have enough to stay at every inn for the rest of the adventure, and that's all I spend it on. So I got my full plate, I'm good, right? I don't need to spend money on anything else. So we started to say like, okay, for us, because this is a game that is about being heroic, we assume that for the most part you have the equipment you need, right? There might be adventures, there might be campaign settings where we modify these rules that I'm talking about, right? Right now we're talking about the core gameplay experience. So there were a few things we did around that, right? And we extrapolated, your purchasing power into these two stats, right? So there's a stat called wealth, and that wealth is like, what is your material wealth? And basically, as you adventure, your wealth score goes up, and there's a table that shows the kinds of things that you can use your money to do. You could buy a ship, you could stay in an inn, you could get a house, you could, hire a carriage, all these different things that you might want to do, we put on the list. But we don't expect this to be a game where you can, like, go buy potions, right? Or you can go buy a magic sword. And so those things are not included on the list. So this is mostly about, like, narratively, what can my wealth do for me? Renown is about what can I get people to do for me based on my reputation. So like wealth, your renown is a number that goes up as you adventure and as you do things, and renown can help you do a couple different things. First, we have negotiations, right, which is a form of social engagement. We talked a little bit about it last time. So renown can help you in negotiations if the person has heard of you, right? Like, there's a good chance that even if you're super famous, if you walk into the, tomb of the slumbering dragon and the dragon has been slumbering for 3,000 years, they don't know who you are, right? So your renown's not going to help you in those situations. But if you're talking to a king and you've been saving all of the nearby kingdoms, king's probably going to know who you are, and your renown is going to affect that and give you a better chance of succeeding at negotiating with them, right? But the other thing it does is it helps you get other rewards, right? And those other rewards are specifically these followers that we were talking about. So artisans. And artisans can help you make treasures. They can help you make other stuff too, airships and stone servants, right? Who work for you, and all kinds of. They can help build roads for you if you want to, that kind of thing. And sages help you do research. And sometimes it might be like, I would really like this particular suit of magic armor, or I would like to know where the enemy we're trying to find is hiding. And that's going to require somebody really, like, digging into the books or going out there and talking to people. We're going to send this other person to do the research while we go over here and deal with this chimera that has been attacking everybody, right? And then there are also retainers, and retainers are like sidekicks that you can bring with you in battle as well. And they are also attracted to you based on your renown. So we have those kind of two mechanisms that do a lot of what gold would do in other games, because we feel like it's more heroic to say, like, these are the things that wealth takes care of, but these are the things that your reputation takes care of. And I think for me and Matt, personally, Matt Colville, our design director, counting every last gold piece is not a specifically heroic feeling thing, right? Like, it actually feels...
It feels like taxes.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's fun. Don't get me wrong. Gathering up gold pieces in dungeon crawling games is a thing that I love to do and have done for a long time and will do until the day I die. In a game where it's like you're supposed to be a hero, it feels really weird to be like, and also we're hoarding all of this wealth, and here is how much money we have, and we're going to get more, right? And it's like, that really shouldn't be the primary motivating factor, which is why... We want you to have ambition. We want you to get treasure, right? But we want you to want to get treasure because that treasure is going to make you a better hero, right? That's ultimately what we stumbled upon. Like, you want that magic sword, but the reason you want that magic sword is going to help you kill a vampire, right? You want that magic armor, but the reason you want that magic armor is because it's going to help you walk through the fires of hell so that you can go save a bunch of people who are trapped there, right? And so for us... that was really what it was about. And that's also why crafting is a big component of this game, because you can also craft the treasures that you want to have, right? Like, hey, maybe you don't know where there is a suit of armor that can protect you from the fires of hell. However, you do know that if you were to get the scales of a dragon, you would be able to construct that suit, right? So maybe you go talk to a dragon. Maybe you either fight them if they're a bad dragon or negotiate with them if they're a good dragon to get some of their scales, right? And explain why you need it and that sort of thing. So that is the biggest component for us. Sorry, this is such a long answer to your question.
No, it's great.
The big thing for us when it comes to, like, item treasure is, like, we want people to want that stuff because it will make them better heroes, right? And so, I think one of the coolest things about The Hobbit is, right, when they find that troll cache, and it's like, here you go, Bilbo, here's a magic sword, Sting, and it's like, Sting saves the day multiple times, right? But it's only because of Bilbo's bravery that Sting is important, right? And so we wanted to keep that aspect of it.
Yeah, wow, thank you. Yeah, a lot there. You've done a very good job, I think, of introducing, specifically gearing treasures and loot for the heroic experience. And if I can just briefly, I think, introduce this idea to people, maybe if you're unfamiliar with it, is you can think of there being sort of two archetypes. There are many more, but, you know, just for the sake of this conversation, you can think of there as being two archetypes of style of game for a Dungeons and Dragons style game. You can be kind of like Conan the Barbarian, or you can be like the Fellowship of the Rings. In the past, both of these kinds of games were played in Dungeons and Dragons, and the difference between them was, in one, you are very money-oriented, and you aren't trying to particularly be heroic. You don't have a quest, for example. You kind of just want to increase your wealth, and that is the main sign of progression. And in the other style of game, you have a sort of immediate task, and you're playing now as heroes in the Fellowship of the Rings and the Lord of the Rings style thing. So you don't have time to stop at that dungeon just to get more loot when you're on a quest to save the world, right?
Right.
Over time, I think designers have kind of realized that these are really two different style of game, and they deserve two different style of system, even though I think most tabletop RPG players like both kinds of games. Like, I want to play a heroic game, but sometimes I also want to play a more pulp Conan the Barbarian game. I have really liked in the more modern era where designers have started to design systems specifically for each of these experiences, and Draw Steel is definitely more for the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Rings, heroic quest kind of game, right?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And it's funny, right? Like, Lord of the Rings is not without piles of gold, particularly in The Hobbit, right? The dwarves are on their way to go reclaim this cache of gold that Smaug has taken from them, but it is more about retaking their home, right?
Yes.
It is more about, like, this is where we lived and this is where we want to be. And so we know that, like, glittering piles of gold are part of fantasy, and it's one reason that we have the wealth score, right? Because you can say then as a director, like, hey, everybody's wealth score increases, right? And here's why, and here's where it goes. But it means that you don't need to track it. When you're tracking every last gold piece, it's because the game you're playing is more about resource management, right? And we talked in the last chat about how our game isn't really about the sort of attrition style resource management that these other games are part of. And so this just seemed like a natural progression for us. And it's also part of wanting to give people ambition beyond greed, if that makes sense. Beyond, like, money greed. And because it feels more heroic. Yeah. You nailed it on the head.
So when you were talking about renown and wealth, it taps into something that I kind of discovered when I was doing my own first principles approach to loot, which is one of the big purposes of these things isn't necessarily mechanical. It is just to provide a kind of concrete score and sense of accomplishment. And players do want to play through that kind of narrative journey of, like, a Conan character who you start out very poor, a slave practically. But of course, Conan becomes a king, right? And he becomes a king through accumulating more and more wealth and more renown. And even if you don't do anything with, like, you're not using your money to buy an item to help you in combat, you still want to have that sense of narrative progression. I think a lot of games I've played confuse these two different functions of money is something that you use to buy better performance in combat or in encounters, and money as just being a signifier of a kind of narrative journey for your character. And so it seems to me like you guys have separated them. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct, and that Conan analogy is a great one, right? Because you can think over and over again, right? Same is true of Bilbo beginning into the Hobbit. Aragorn, right, becomes the king and gets a sword upgrade, right? Like, all these kinds of things we see that happen, I think, are part of the journey. And it's also, we often, when we're watching media, will see the writers revert people back to the state that they were in at the beginning of the story temporarily to kind of, like, can we recapture the magic? Because now it's so, it's so weird now that Spider-Man is a substitute teacher and married to Mary Jane. Can we send him back to being a single guy who barely, can scrape his living together and that kind of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's a huge part of it for sure. The story progression, right? You just want to see the characters that you like. And hopefully you like the character that you created better off than they were at the start of the story.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I think, is how different that is from video game RPGs for my audience of mostly video game RPG enthusiasts, where in video games like Baldur's Gate 3, Baldur's Gate 2, Pillars of Eternity, Divinity Original Sin 2, money is just liquid treasures, right? Where it's a kind of resource which you can choose to spend in shops to buy the gear specifically for your character. And that is really as far as it goes. It doesn't have this sense of narrative progression nearly as much as in tabletop RPGs. So yeah, that's a big distinction. And if I can get at maybe another way, actually, you know what? I'm not going to talk about that one yet. I want to talk about a different one. So this is the first principle in my mind for loot design is you have loot in your games to give people a sense of accomplishment, and it's a kind of narrative accomplishment. It's not really tied to their mechanical progression. The second principle I'd like to talk about is just the very practical need of including loot in your games just as an incentive to play and as a kind of prize to maintain interest. At least in my games, this is something I've noticed is very important, is players, they like the game of killing monsters and disarming traps and of political intrigue. They like to play it, but they like it much more when they get something at the end of it. And I haven't figured out exactly why, because you think if the game is fun, isn't that the reward? And it is, but it's just more fun when there's also a reward, right? Have you guys noticed that?
Oh, yeah, definitely, right? And it's why games throughout history, right? Video games, board games, tabletop games, right? Have this incentive of like, you get something for your win, right? And one of the great things about video games and tabletop games is that like it's not gambling in the sense of like you're not going to lose money if you fail to grab that magic sword, right? Right. So there's a lower risk, often higher reward, right? In the sense of like in your imagination that you are getting something from that. Advancement, right, is part of that too. Getting experience and your character becoming more powerful, huge. But so is, hey, now you also have better equipment. And some games do one thing, right? Like there are many games out there that are often simpler, or they're like real focused on getting stuff and crafting, right? Like your Minecraft, right? Games that are often like the way you get better is by getting better stuff, right? Right. And then there are some games where it's like, look, the way you get better is by leveling, and that's it. But I think a lot of games do both. It's like get better stuff and get better stats. And that is the incentive that keeps you coming back to play. Because the other thing that does, right, getting that magic sword, not only does that mean that, like, hey, I've got this reward, there's another benefit that we intrinsically know, right, but we don't really ever talk about, which is you unlock more content, right? You are now tougher, which means you can fight bigger, maybe more complicated, maybe more interesting, but maybe even just cooler looking monsters, right? You can, hey, now you have this item that lets you teleport throughout the multiverse. That's amazing. Now I can go to new worlds and I can do different stuff like that. So that's the other, I think, incentive that is in there, right? It's the, hey, this is something for me, but it's also like, oh, now the story has changed. What else can we do now that we have this thing, which is cool.
That's a very good point, and it is something you can see in a lot of games, is that there's a kind of design which I actually associate with Larian, but Larian before Baldur's Gate 3, and mostly in their Divinity Original Sin era, where they would have an open world, but the level progression was so important for what your character could do. You were effectively locked out of areas. Like, you were free to go in there, but you're just going to get your butt kicked if you do, unless you're a certain level or you've acquired a certain level of loot. Yeah, absolutely true in role-playing games as well, yeah. Like, when I'm flipping through the monster manual, of course it is fun killing orcs and goblins and kobolds, but you do want to be fighting dragons and beholders. And
I mean, it's right there in the name, and the beholders are right there on the cover of the book, right? Like, and I think that fantasy is really, really strong, and it is funny, right? I've run a lot of games over the last couple months for my nephews who are like 10 and 11.
Oh, that's fun.
And they have a very much like a stay away until we are powerful enough to fight that thing attitude, right? Like, whereas a lot of adults are just like, let's just go for it. And you're like, uh-oh, here we go. And so it is cool to see that, like, the wheels turn in people's head then when they get those things and say, aha, now we can be even more heroic, right? It's great.
So just to add, another thing I've noticed about this principle of treasures and loot being an incentive to keep playing and a way to sustain interest is, particularly in sustaining interest, I find that they don't work if they don't alter the way your character mechanically performs well enough, right? And so there's a kind of design philosophy of very incremental gains when it comes to loot. And I have found that philosophy suffers a lot when it comes to sustaining interest of the players. And what's happened for me when I run games like this is I'll give my players, say, a +1 sword, and the first time they get it, they're really excited. And then they discover through experience that +1 sword is not altering, it's not qualitatively altering their experience of play enough. And so really it wasn't a change, right? And then when I give them that +2 sword, they're not excited anymore. or they are because it's a reward. They're just excited about other things than this principle, which is a prize or an incentive to keep playing. And so far in my audit that I've done of your guys' treasures that you've released in the October Patreon packet, it seems like you guys understand this principle very well, because especially leveled treasures that you've released are significantly altering the play of your character in a way that it changes things enough to keep it interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's funny. So leveled treasures, which a lot of them are like weapons and armor or, a magic ring, things that we expect that you are going to keep with you throughout your adventuring career, no matter when you find them, right? Maybe you're level 5, maybe you're level 1, maybe you're level 10, right? Whatever it is, when you find that thing, you're going to keep it. That's also part of the heroic story too, right? Like you never see, or I shouldn't say you never, but you rarely see like, a hero like pick up a magic weapon and throw away the other magic weapon that they are holding, because now they have a +2 sword, right? And this other one with +1, so let's get rid of it, right? And so
I'm glad you brought that up. That's something I want to talk about. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
Oh, no, yeah, that's great, right? And so that was one of the ideas behind leveled treasures, was like, we know that you want to have a really cool magic item at 10th level that feels really powerful, but we can't give you the full Mjolnir, right? For instance, we can't give you all of that power right at level 1. Otherwise, the director is going to have a really hard time challenging you. And if only one of you has that weapon, right? It's a group game. Everybody should get a chance to shine. If only one of you has this really powerful weapon, it means that you become the star of the show and the other players feel left out, right? And like the weapon is doing the heroic stuff, not you, right? And so that runs counter to a lot of our design goals. So what is the way to do that? And so leveled treasures, the idea is like they grow in power with you, right? And so the first thing we figured out was like, okay, you've got this progression where obviously if you've got a weapon, right, the damage, it improves your damage output, and that it scales as you level. Great. So your +1 sword effectively becomes a +2 sword, and then effectively becomes a +3 sword. That sort of thing, if we were to use D&D as an analogy. But like you said earlier, that's not enough. People want an item that is more than just, hey, this is more damage for me. And so we got in there and we thought about like, okay, there should be like qualities that these things have too, in addition to the extra damage, the extra protection, the extra accuracy, whatever it is that they give to you. So we started to think about like, okay, what are some good ways to do that? And now one of the best ways that we can do that, right, is to say, hey, James, lead designer, you go make some of these, and then bring in the other designers, Willie and Jordy, and, then we got some freelance designers, right, to come in and work on this stuff and start building out their own treasures, because they bring their own ideas then to it, right? And there's stuff in there that I never would have thought of on my own that, then we end up making these really great and fun items. So that was the big philosophy behind the leveled treasures. We also have trinkets, right? And trinkets are more of your classic, hey, this item does one thing, you might keep it with you forever, but that's it. It doesn't do anything else. But we also wanted to make them kind of flavorful. There were some things that we felt like, oh, we have to have. You know, we have to have a bag that can hold a lot of stuff because people
yeah, that is important.
Find one of those. yeah, like those kinds of things. But then we also thought, like, what would be fun to have in here that we think would be cool and interesting and also mechanically impactful. And then we have consumable items, potions and stuff like that you can use. Often they have like a one-time kind of powerful punch effect, and then you go from there. And now, you know, it's out there in the world, and we just got a bunch of feedback on it. And so, like, I'm going through and revising them because I am looking for exactly what you're talking about, Aestus, which is the juice worth the squeeze? Right? And one thing that we did that I didn't realize would be a benefit, but I am now in reading playtest survey, is we have a crafting system. So every single one of these items that is in the thing, you can also craft if you have the right components and recipe for, right? Which means that the director then has a little control over what you can make, right? If you don't want people making a zillion healing potions, don't give them a zillion ingredients to make healing potions.
Right.
But what it means is that we're getting feedback survey from people who are like, I can't see a situation in which I would ever craft this item, right? And to me, that says like, aha, that means this item isn't cool enough, right? It's not doing anything that is attracting someone to that. And so that has been really, really helpful in those circumstances, because I think there is, if you were just getting it from adventuring, right, finding it in a tomb or whatever, you might not give feedback like that. You'd be like, yeah, I guess if I got this, I would write it on my sheet, but I'd probably never use it. But you may not tell me that the way you would say, like, this is not worth engaging with the rules to get for me. And that's important for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, frankly, that's the area where I'm really kind of jealous of you guys. Is there's so much about a loot design that you can't know until you put it in front of players, and not just, you know, me putting it in front of my 5 regulars. I mean, you need, you know, dozens, maybe even hundreds if you're lucky, right, of people to test this. Because, yeah, you're right. There's ways of thinking about things that you just cannot predict. And there's an element, there's a kind of vibe to the attractiveness of items that it's impossible to know until you put it into a significant sample size of people. I would love to talk more about trinkets and consumables. I have several posts and large lists of trinkets and consumables I've designed in the Homebrew channel. But I'm not sure if we will have the time, and instead what I'd really like to focus on is this idea of level treasures, because for me, this was a breakthrough.
Oh, good.
I learned about level treasures by playing, in the late 2010s, the Pillars of Eternity games and the Divinity Original Sin games, which I've mentioned here. These are games that I've cover on my channel. And at the time, these two companies were kind of competitors. Both of them were releasing high-end CRPGs that were in what I call the isometric revival era of history. It was a callback to an earlier style of game, the original Baldur's Gate series, the Infinity Engine games like Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale. They were both designing very similar style of games, and they both took very different design directions in a lot of areas, and one of them was loot. And Obsidian with Pillars of Eternity did a leveled loot system where you would get unique items that would have what I think, I always use actually Colville language for this. I would call them very action-oriented design.
Nice.
They would have something that they did that was unique to them, and it was an action kind of thing. It wasn't just stats. Through crafting, you could improve the statistical advancement of the item, which is something you guys mimic. Your crafting is different, but the statistical progression of the item is it just happens as you level in your guys' system. There are level thresholds, level 1, level 5, and level 9. And when you meet those thresholds, your item will improve, both statistically, but also usually the action that it does increases for you guys, which is something that Obsidian, they went that direction as well when they got to Pillars of Eternity Deadfire. And this was in contrast to Larian's approach, was very incremental, statistic oriented, and where you would replace, like you'd start with your magical axe and you would replace it later with an even better magical axe, and you would replace that one. And over the course of the game, you'd go through, half a dozen weapons, half a dozen sets of armor. And I do think that was kind of the old approach. And what I realized from these comparing these games is that I think what Larian was missing and that Obsidian realized was that loot is at least partially identity constituting. And that is a lot of technical jargon, but what I mean by that is, for players, they consider that sword that they get to be part of the identity of their character, and that is why they do not want to abandon it, right? Like, if you're thinking of Thor, Mjolnir is a part of his identity. It's part of what gives him powers. It's a major part of what he does. And so, like you said, you don't see in heroic literature where a character will abandon a magic item they get to upgrade to a bigger one. It's very rare. And what I notice when I kind of did
it's a big deal when it happens, right?
It's a big deal when it happens. And what I notice is the conditions in which it happens in literature are usually like this. Take Thor as an example. He has Mjolnir. This is a big part of his identity. Mjolnir, he doesn't abandon it. It just gets destroyed. And this is a major part of his character arc, right? It's a kind of downtime for him. And then when he gets a new weapon, it's because he crafts what you guys would call an artifact, which is a legendary weapon which he uses almost exclusively to defeat the final boss. So to me, when you're abandoning a weapon, it's always for narrative purposes. And when you're replacing it with something new, it's... I started calling it, after the D&D movie came out, I call it the Helm of Disjunction kind of item. So people who've watched Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves... By the way, James, have you watched it?
Oh my god. I love it. It's an amazing movie. Yes, I've seen it.
In this movie, D&D Honor Among Thieves, there is two items that you can contrast. There is the Hither Thither Rod, and there is the Helm of Disjunction. And I think these are two very, very separate functions for loot. It was a big breakthrough for me to notice this difference. The Hither Thither Rod is what I would consider is a good level treasure. This is the kind of thing which does something which your players are going to use to solve their problems. And these are the kind of treasures which become identity constituting, right? They form your character. The Helm of Disjunction, you'll notice, is very different. It is an end-game plot device, which is only used in the final encounter. And the design for these two types of things are very, very different. That's just what I've noticed. What do you think about that, James? Am I making sense? Or
No, you absolutely are. And I think that's one of the great things about magic items, right, particularly, is that in all of these games we're talking about, they tend to occupy a lot of different spaces because they are independent of the character wielding them, right? And so it's like, cool, this one shoots fireballs, this one shoots portals, right? This one turns you into a mouse, and it's like, wait, I want the thing that shoots fireballs. I don't want to turn into a mouse. And it's like, you haven't really thought through the utility of becoming a mouse then, right? And what that can mean. And I think that's particularly in tabletop, because you are unburdened by like, oh god, you want a magic item where you can turn into a mouse. Well, somebody's going to need to animate that, somebody's going to need to program that, right? Somebody's going to need to playtest all of that, right? We just have the playtesting step, and it's a lot easier. I think that is a huge part of the game. Is treasure is also a place, and this is another reason players love getting it, and it's also why, like, we specifically are putting it in the player book, and we are giving rules for crafting it so that you can have the ambition and plan ahead. It's that, like, you can customize your hero through those things, and that's another big part of why it's part of your hero's identity, because all of a sudden, right, if you become the warrior who shoots fireballs, right, that's part of it. But I do think that those what I think of as, like, broadly useful items, right, like the Hither Thither staff, are huge to give to players, because it really opens up what, to me, RPGs are all about, which is thinking outside the box and getting creative, right? And so, like, obviously, when you have these big plot device items, right, those are important to the story, right? And you're going to probably use them one way. And I think it's one reason the One Ring, right, not to keep going back to the Lord of the Rings but it's why it is such an important item, because it is both. It is a giant plot item, but it's also broadly useful, right? Like being invisible is good for spying, it's good for running away, it's good for fighting an enemy, right? All of those things are great about it. And you can create interesting narrative problems, right? Somebody's wearing the ring, how do we know where they are? When you can do both, you've really done something special, although not everything can be the one ring. Sometimes something just needs to be like, hey, this is just a cool staff that is going to let you get from point A to point B, and people are going to use the heck out of it to solve all kinds of great problems, and that's fun.
Yeah. What you call items that are broadly useful, I call them sandbox items, where
that's great.
Yeah, there's a style of play where you give someone a very open-ended kind of ability, and then the fun of it is in creatively using it. Hither Thither is a great example, but with those items, what I've noticed is I find that they're not identity items as much because they don't belong to a player, they belong to the party.
Yeah.
So yeah, the whole party has fun using them, but no one feels particularly attached. Whereas if you give a player a baby dragon that they train, that's their dragon, right? It's very important to the player that no one else in the party owns it, right? Or if you give the warrior that magical sword, that's their sword. The same thing doesn't really apply to the sandbox items, I've noticed, but
oh, yeah.
one principle, and this is something I wonder if you guys have realized or thought about just as I've kind of looked over the items you've released so far, is in a level progression the way you do, like a 3-tier system. So you have level 1, level 5, and level 9, which interestingly is exactly what I started doing this back in 2019 in the D&D 5e campaigns I was running. But I did the thresholds at level 1, level 5, and level 8. So very close. It's funny how we both landed on those numbers. Yeah. But one of the things I really quickly learned, at least I thought I learned, maybe you guys have discovered differently, is that I had this instinct where there was a natural progression where the level 5 thing you got had to be better than the level 1 thing you got. And the level 9 thing you got had to be better than both the level 5 and level 1. Right?
Sure.
A thing that I noticed is that my items started working much better if I made the really, really powerful good feature the level 5 feature rather than the level 9 one. Mostly because I think a lot of players don't reach high levels in a game.
Fair.
And yeah, you just want to give them your best stuff at the time that they can actually get it. Now, you can't give it to them at level 1 because you lose that incentive and that sense of accomplishment that we've already talked about. But the problem is that if you give it to them as the level 9 feature, you get that Helm of Disjunction design where your level 9 stuff isn't the stuff that your character can do. It's just the stuff that your character does at the very end of your campaign to defeat the boss. It's a very lock and key design. And so with my players, I started to have much more success when I picked out what is the coolest thing that this can do, and I made that the level 5 feature. And often the level 9 feature is worse in terms of power. But I find that late game motivations are less about loot and what you can do. Have you guys noticed that or thought about that at all?
Well, I think that's a really good question. We haven't had any discussion like that, and it's one of those things where like we're now getting into testing those levels, right? And so we may very well discover what you have already discovered, right? And say like, oh, we should turn back here and we should do these things this way. A lot of the features of our leveled items often build on what has come before, right?
True.
So
yeah,
sometimes it's like, hey, this thing, in fact, I should probably bring up an example here while I'm talking to you so that it's not just me making up stuff. So, there are things like the Lance of the Sundered Star, right?
Right.
That essentially, it lets you push targets around, and then it improves your ability with the charge keyword and gives you flying. And then it's like the 9th level thing is like, well, when you push or slide a target, now the force movement can be vertical, so it sort of needs to build on the things that have come. But it's a good question about, like, is the 5th level feature, which whenever you take the charge action, you can use an ability that allows you to shift your movement as the fly keyword, is flying cooler than being able to flip a target into the air, right?
Right.
Well, the fly is pretty specific, so it might be that the 9th level feature here is actually cooler.
Yeah.
I will say that for us, right, one of the things that we're trying to avoid, and so this goes hand in hand with the level design, is we want people to be able to play high-level games of Draw Steel faster and reach high level faster than they do in D&D, because we know that most people don't, right?
That's something Jordy mentioned,
Yeah, and so that is going to be a big part of this experiment, right? Is like, well, is it okay to have some of this high-level stuff here? I think the other thing that we think about is, like, if you're getting something at 5th level, we don't want it to feel like filler, right? We don't want it to feel like, hey, the 1 and 9th level here are really cool, but the 5th level isn't. Or the 1 and 5 are not that cool, but the 9th is. And so I think for us, right, we're trying to think about, like, okay, can we also make everything cool when you get it? And it's, yes, maybe the 9th is the most powerful version of this cool thing that you're getting. But for the most part, it tends to be like, okay, these things are a progression of what has come before, so it only makes sense for the 9th to be better. But yeah, that's a great thing that I have written down, and I am going to be looking out for it when I go through playtest feedback now.
Cool,
that's cool.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
I'm excited to see what you guys think about it in your testing, because it could be, like I said, you guys have access to so much more resources when it comes to testing. How many ideas seem cool in theory and maybe cool when you run them for your 5 regular players, but they just don't pan out. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. But I'll just say with that lens that you mentioned, the way I would do it in my philosophy is I would make both the vertical pushing and the flying a level 5 feature. And then the level 9 feature you do would be like a statistical increase. Like it would increase the distance that you fly and increase the amount that you can push them. And it feels bad to do that, because you want to, like I said, you want action oriented design. You want to avoid just simple statistical increases as much as possible. But the time when players are most easily accept simple increases like that is at the beginning of the game, whenever everything new is cool, and then at the end of the game, when they're less motivated by loot anymore. What they want is to defeat the boss, and every little edge that they can get to defeat the boss is valuable to them. But yeah, at the middle, that's when they want that kind of qualitatively different, altering their style of play, so they can build around those things, is my experience. But sorry, we're running out of time. Actually,
I do just want to say, I want to throw one more thing at you, because there's another point in your favor of the way you're designing, which is also that by 9th level, you've got so much stuff you need to remember that a nice statistical increase you can just write down and isn't a new feature that you have to remember is also good.
That's a good point. The last sort of principle in loot design that I feel like I discovered in my exploration, I use a lot of philosophy terms for these things. So I called it a principle of individuation, which, okay, it's like this. A class, if you're selecting a class when you're building your character, this is something that is constant between games, right? So if I play a fighter and my cousin Bob plays a fighter, we're both playing the same class. And what's one function of loot that is really important is that it individuates my fighter from Bob's fighter. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That we've talked about how it has to individuate the way those fighters play. It has to make the way they play different, mechanically speaking. But I also think it's really important, narratively speaking, that it's different. Actually, I think this is something that Matt Colville taught me when he talked about, I can't remember the title of the video now, but
I think it's Toward Better Rewards.
Yeah, I think that was it. Yeah. When I was doing level treasures, I started to make narrative conditions for unlocking the level treasures, and I would design my treasures around a narrative theme. So, for example, I could send this to you if you'd like, and I'll also post the doc in the comments. I designed a treasure called Wrath. It's an axe, a magical axe called Wrath. And there's a little short story about it where it belonged to a kind of ancient order of knights, and they were given a charge that they would have to master wrath, or they would have to master tyranny. And so each of the weapons they were given had a vice as a name. You know, it was the function of you mastered it by becoming a master of this physical weapon, but it also meant you had to master that vice in yourself. So in the level treasure Wrath, there are 2 progressions that you can take. You can either choose to master Wrath, which is to embody a kind of fighting style of patience and calmness and serenity. Or you could embrace wrath, which is to go a direction of kind of like a barbarian, where you fight with rage and violence. To follow these progressions, you had to meet certain narrative conditions, and that was massive for me. And it's something I've noticed you guys are doing, but you're doing it with titles, not with weapons. And I wonder if you could explain that to me.
Yeah, so we had that same idea, that same thing you talked about, we've talked about in our meetings. We want people with the same class, same subclass, same ancestry to feel different and have history to them. And titles are that. So titles are abilities that you gain, sort of like feats in D&D, but you unlock them through adventuring. Maybe you got to kill a dragon. Maybe you need to be named a king. Maybe you need to get a griffin mount, right? Like there are all kinds of different things you could do. You can be in a bar fight to gain a title. The idea there is like these are the narrative experiences. It's sort of like a different way of looking at experience points that's also in the game. Because your character has been through this, you can now do this. That magic item, your approach, I have also seen. We did it in the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount when I was working on that. You can see some treasures there where it's like things get unlocked based on the deeds you've done and that sort of thing. But yeah, the reason we wanted to separate it here was we like that idea for titles, and we've done titles in previous 5e products, so we wanted to bring that in, and we thought it felt like there are other things that you can do to unlock magic items, but that is like adventuring. That's finding the ingredients to craft them, that sort of thing. They're already hidden behind narrative gates, so we didn't want to put more there, which was ultimately how we ended up there.
At this point, James had to quickly leave to make another appointment, so that's all we recorded. I thought this discussion was a blast, and I learned a lot. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it too. If you want more content like this, please consider subscribing, liking the video, or commenting below. I'm in a phase right now where I am exploring how much time and attention I should give towards Draw Steel content and interviews. I love doing these, but to be honest, YouTube kind of hates me for it. Anyways, all that's to say, if it matters to you, a like and subscribe now goes a long way. We'll just leave it at that. Regardless, thanks for watching, guys. A big thanks again to James for his time and insight. I'll catch you guys next time.